So the readings from Genesis 15, starting to read at verse 1. The Lord's covenant with Abram. After this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield and your very great reward. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the only one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Abraham believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. He also said to him, I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I shall gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and ill-treated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking brazier with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, To your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Thanks be to God.
Good morning again, everybody. Actually, when we were doing the communion, I was reminded, I can't remember where the quote comes from. I think it was probably a South American priest. They kind of be in the habit of saying these things. But if he said, the government tells me if I give my food to the poor, they celebrate me. But if I ask why are they the poor, they put me in prison. And it's a strange kind of world that we live in. What does it mean to be God's representatives on the earth, where the voices of the poor cries out and we ask whether or not they're heard or not? Yesterday morning, we had a leaders' breakfast. So elders and deacons, those who were able to gather, Chris and Alicia, who's our minister in training, also gathered, came to be with us to pray and to think about some of the, particularly to think about the feedback that we've got from the surveys, and we'll be talking more about that on Wednesday evening for those church members who are able to come and join us. But I shared a little bit about a book that I've recently read, which made the rather bold claim, to say the least, that probably for the last 40 years or so, the church, evangelical church in Europe and particularly in North America, has been doing it all wrong, kind of. That we've been asking the question that the church is broke, so how do we fix it? And the writer of the book was saying this is the wrong question, because it locates the solution to the problem largely with us, something we need to do differently that will fix it. The book argued the better question to ask is, God remains present in the world. God's Spirit is in our neighborhoods. God is as active now as he has ever been. The question we should be asking is, where on earth has he got to now? Join him in what he is already doing. When we went into lockdown, probably for most of us, it felt like church life had been put on hold. Familiar patterns of worship, of gathering in this space, which for a number of us, has been your regular pattern for many, many years, disappeared overnight. And familiar patterns in the way you met with God and felt blessed and encouraged and built up for the coming week disappeared. And some of the feedback we got overwhelmingly said we missed that. We desperately missed that, being with people, being in this space together. But one of the things we've stressed throughout all of this is God has not been put on hold. God has not been in lockdown. The gospel has not been confined in the way that we have felt confined. Just like Paul chained up in prison, they may have silenced him, but he knew with all his heart they hadn't silenced the gospel. That the Spirit of God continued to roam across the face of the earth, seeking out those who might be saved. God has promised never to leave us or forsake us. Paul said that there is nothing that you can imagine or fear that will ever separate you from the love of God. The psalmist reminds us that the earth is still the Lord's, and everything in it, that there is not a place, as a theologian once put it, there is not a corner of the earth where God does not cry out, mine. This is my space. And so when the writer of Genesis says that God comes to Abraham and says, do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. Look up to the sky, count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. Now, the problem, of course, with living in the city, when you count the stars, it's a relatively straightforward job. You can see about 4. But if I was to take you to where I grew up, to my parents' house, which is right out in the countryside in rural Suffolk, and when the children were younger, in fact, we probably still would do this, we would go out at night on a clear night and lie on our backs in the garden and look up at and it was like a cloud. And you could see the Milky Way streaming over. Knock yourself out, count that lot. This is God's covenant, God's promise. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. So do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. There's 3 things about this story. Here you go, 3 things that I want us to reflect on just for a little while. As we think about these last few months and the months and years that lie ahead, the reminder once again that before all else, God is. God is here. He has gone before you. He will come after you. He will hold you. He will lift you. He has made promises to you that he will never revoke. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. My presence invades all things. And this promise is made for the one who is all powerful, to the one who is powerless, utterly incapable of fixing this while we were yet sinners. Christ died for us. God takes the initiative. God comes into our world. This is not a prize that we earn. It's a gift of grace because God chooses to come to us. And God chooses to speak to us the very words he spoke to Abraham. God puts his trust and his confidence in this aging couple. And again, he puts his trust and his confidence in us. Look up at the sky and count the stars. Generation upon generation of God's people have paused for a moment and looked up to the sky, looked up to the stars, and fear has fled from them. The second thing I want to point out is that God makes this promise in the midst of Abraham and Sarah's barrenness. There is no heir, and there is no possibility of an heir. There is a womb that remains closed, an infertile couple, desperate for an heir who will inherit all that they have achieved in life. And all they see is aging and death and loss, and the doors of their homes that will one day close, and someone else will pick through whatever's left. But God invites them in that moment to believe and to imagine another world and another possibility, to imagine another future and another story, and a future and a story that defies everything that they can see in front of them and everything that they are experiencing in their bodies. This is not the whole story. This is not the full story. To consider the possibility that the closed womb of the present will give way to new birth and to a new future. A future more glorious and mysterious than all the heavens can speak of. He invites them to put their trust in him. Rather than thinking that you can fix this, trust me. Because I am the creator who brings life from nothing. Jesus would ask the disciples, who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. John records it this way, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life. And we have come to believe that you are the Holy One of God. And so God, in the midst of a barren world, makes his promises to us again. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Again and again and again into our barrenness and our hopelessness, God promises stars beyond counting, a future beyond our imagining. But thirdly, he invites us in obedient and trusting faith to embrace this promise and to embrace this life and to wake each day knowing, defying what we think we know. To say this is the truth upon which I live and upon which I die. This is no peaceful, pious acceptance, but a hard-fought and deeply disturbing truth that Abraham and Sarah are invited to embrace. It will be marked with sacrifice and death, that strange, mysterious vision we see in that story. Deep darkness and uncertainty, but the question again, will you trust? And in the pain of their barrenness, this distance of the promises fulfillment beyond their lifetime, 400 years. Imagine hearing that. We struggle with hearing something that God won't bring into our lives in 400 minutes, let alone 400 years. And yet God is not slow in keeping his promises. His timeline and his patience are beyond understanding. Do not be afraid. One day this people will wander for 40 years in the wilderness, wondering whatever happened to the promise. But they will know that God wandered with them. He did not desert them. This is not an if Jesus came back tonight, what would you find? What would he find in your life kind of evangelism? If you died today, where would you go? That kind of scare tactic, but used by well-meaning Christians that often terrifies people and turns God into some kind of insurance policy rather than the Lord of all and the one in whom you must commit your life and your very being. Of course, in the next chapter, Abraham and Sarah fail at the first hurdle, and we get the miserable, desperately sad story of Hagar and Ishmael. Despite all those promises, despite God encountering them, they still think it's their job to manipulate and to control, to work things at the pace they want to work them at, rather than trusting God. We are so often the same. In an impatient world, we are invited to be the most patient of all people. Wars come and go, rulers come and go, governments come and go. But the word of the Lord stands forever. And upon that do we put our trust. And so this reminder today that God remains the maker of promises. The maker of promises to us, to you and to me, to this church and to all God's people. He comes again and again into our spaces. And in these last few months, we have discovered him hanging out in places we never expected him to be. And we have been blessed. And just as Abraham was the broken and sinful bearer of this promise, getting it right sometimes and getting it wrong at other times, and yet held up in the pantheon of saints, so we too are called to embody this promise. God's commitment to us and God's commitment to one another. We will never leave you. We will never forsake you. We will walk through the wilderness with you. We will sit with you in your barren times. We will watch over you when the promise remains unfulfilled. We will be as Christ to you. We will not flee at the first insight, in the first instance of trouble or inconvenience. But just as God remains with us through all things, so we will remain with you through all things. And so we will live out this promise that transcends all the promises of the world, that no political party or ism will ever be able to deliver to us. This covenant life, this life based in unconditional promise. The promise of God over his people. But to live obediently to that promise, to not take it for granted, to not leave it to one side in our lives, but to let it fill every part of our being so that we can't help but overflow. As God sent Christ into the world, so he sends us. As the bearers of this promise made to all of creation, so shall your sons and daughters be. Do not be afraid. I am your shield, your very great reward. Look up at the sky and count the stars if indeed you can. So shall your offspring be. And upon that, we enjoy our Sabbath rest. Amen.